I remember that afternoon with painful clarity. It was the afternoon the divorce papers slid across the glass table and came to a halt right in front of my hands, looking more like an overdue invoice than the final period at the end of a 3-year marriage. The coffee shop was on the second floor, overlooking a busy avenue right in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, traffic piled up under the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air conditioning hummed a steady rhythm, and the smell of roasted coffee beans, mixed with the cloying perfume of the person sitting across from me, left a bitter dryness in my throat. On my left sat my husband Garrett. On his right sat Chloe, my best friend of 20 years. I sat across from them, my hands resting on my leather tote bag, my back straight, and my eyes fixed on the stack of documents his attorney had just handed me. The ink from the law firm's notary stamp was not even completely dry. Everything had been drafted in a concise, clear, and ruthlessly cold manner. The pre-war condo on the Upper West Side, the 3-row Chevy Tahoe we had bought last year, the remaining savings in our joint Chase checking account, even the expensive furniture we had once picked out together with so much excitement. Everything was meticulously divided in lines of black ink on white paper. Only the most important part was missing. "Sign it, Eleanor." Garrett's voice was flat. It was not loud, but it was as hard as the glass table separating us. I looked up to meet his eyes. In 3 years of marriage, I had heard him use all kinds of tones, tender, pleading, irritated, even that glacial silence, but I had never heard him use this tone. He sounded like a warehouse supervisor pressuring an employee to sign a delivery receipt just to get it over with. Chloe, sitting next to him, had her hands painted in deep crimson polish resting lightly on the sleeve of Garrett's suit jacket. With her head slightly tilted, her voice was so soft that anyone who did not know the backstory would have thought she was trying to comfort me out of pure compassion. "Eleanor, you cannot force the heart. If love has run its course, it is better to let it go. What we have is real." I looked at Chloe. I looked at that face, familiar to me since the 3rd grade, those lips that had laughed and chatted with me so many times in my mother's small kitchen. I looked at those eyes that had once filled with tears as she hugged me when my father was admitted to the hospital. I no longer saw my friend of 20 years. Across from me was just a woman trying to use a sweet tone to hide the triumph shining deep in her eyes. The coffee shop was not loud, so the nearby tables could hear us perfectly. I knew they were not turning to look at us directly, but their ears were wide open. Their sidelong glances brushed against us and then silently withdrew. Garrett, growing impatient, drummed his fingers on the table. "I have made it very clear. The property gets divided according to state law. The money gets split right down the middle. I am not letting you walk away empty-handed. Making a scene will not do you any good." I looked down at the papers again. My hands were freezing, but my mind was strangely lucid. That clarity had not come overnight. It did not start that afternoon, or even when I first discovered his betrayal. It started 3 months earlier, the day Chloe showed up at my door with a cream-colored-away suitcase, red eyes and trembling lips, saying she had just broken up with her boyfriend, that she had been kicked out of their shared apartment, and had nowhere to go. That day, I was the one who opened the door for her. "Stay with us for a few days," I told her as I helped drag her suitcase inside. "That is what friends are for." 3 months later, she was sitting across from me, stroking my husband's suit sleeve, as if it were a natural gesture deeply rooted in habit. I flipped to the 2nd page, then the 3rd. The clauses were flawless. Garrett's lawyer was undoubtedly a professional, except he did not know everything. Or maybe he did know and had intentionally left it out. I placed the papers back on the table. "I am not signing." Garrett froze for a couple of seconds, his face turning pale before darkening with anger. "Eleanor, do not cross the line." Chloe gently squeezed his wrist and turned to me with a voice as soft as cotton. "Eleanor, think about it carefully. Clinging to someone who no longer loves you will only hurt you both." I let out a laugh. It was not a loud laugh, just a short, dry sound that even to me felt strange. "Now you are hitting me with that cliché." Chloe was momentarily left speechless. Garrett furrowed his brow. "Stop speaking in riddles. I have already made my decision." "I know," I replied, looking straight into his eyes. "And precisely because you have already made your decision, I am not signing this." Garrett leaned back in his chair, glaring at me harshly. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He thought I was going to cry, that I was going to beg, that I was going to remind him of our 3 years of marriage, that I was going to use our parents to threaten him. He thought I would do everything a betrayed woman usually does, only to end up signing out of pure helplessness. But I did none of that. I pulled my smartphone out of my bag. Garrett frowned. "Who are you calling?" I did not answer. I just dialed the number. On the other end, the phone rang once before someone picked up. A deep, formal male voice echoed through the receiver. "Go ahead, Harrison. I am listening." I stared at the two people in front of me and enunciated every word slowly. "Harrison, I need you to come to the coffee shop, please. I have decided to go through with the divorce, but from now on, I am setting all the terms." Chloe's hand, still resting on Garrett's arm, tensed up. He leaned forward. "Who the hell is Harrison?" I hung up the phone and left it on the table in no rush to answer him. I took my glass of ice water and took a sip. The cold liquid traveled down my throat, but inside, I felt a dormant fire waking up. 2 weeks earlier, I was the one who called Harrison for the first time. It was a Wednesday, and Garrett was supposed to fly out to Chicago for a 3-day business trip to pitch a client. He had packed his suitcase the night before. In the morning, I left the condo for work as usual. Garrett, still in bed and facing away from me, mumbled a familiar goodbye. I went down to the lobby, waited exactly 15 minutes, and went back up. My morning meeting had been canceled late the previous night, but I had not told him at the time. I just had a simple thought. We had not surprised each other with anything nice in a while. I figured I would come back early, pick up some groceries, and cook a nice dinner. If I had let him know, maybe everything would have been different. At the very least, I would not have heard the words that woke me up completely. I used my key to open the door quietly. The apartment was empty, except for the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside came a woman's laugh, then Garrett's voice, and then Chloe's. They were broken sentences, but clear enough for me to understand exactly what my role in their story was. A boring wife, a woman who only knew how to work, an idiot who trusted her best friend and her husband, a bridge for them to walk all over. I did not kick the door down. I did not cry. I did not scream. I stood outside listening to everything, and then I went downstairs and sat on a bench in the courtyard for 3 hours. It was sunny, but my hands were freezing. I do not know what I was looking at. I just remember an elm leaf falling right on my shoe, and I stared at it for a very long time. Around noon, I called Harrison. He was the corporate attorney who had collaborated with my company for years, handling mostly civil cases and contract law. To him, I was just a standard senior project manager, at least on the surface. I asked him to quietly look into a few matters: the transaction history of our joint bank account, the dealership contract for the Chevy Tahoe that Garrett drove, and some documents related to the condo we lived in. 3 days later, Harrison brought me a thick file. I sat in my office turning each page as I felt the cold take over my entire body. The funds in our joint savings account had been almost completely drained in small increments and transferred to a personal account in Garrett's name. The 3-row Tahoe was not a loaned company car like he had told me. He was financing it, and the $15,000 down payment had come straight out of our joint checking. For the past 6 months, there had been regular monthly Venmo and Zelle transfers to a woman. The memo line sometimes said help, sometimes loan, and sometimes it was just left blank. That woman was Chloe, and that was not all. The Upper West Side condo we lived in was legally solely in my name. The money to buy it had been a gift from my parents before the wedding. The monthly mortgage was also paid out of my personal account. Garrett had only been in charge of dropping off the checks at the bank a few times. Over time, he started telling everyone it was a home we had built together. I never made a big deal out of it. I thought that in a shared life, there was no need to keep score of those things. I now understood that sometimes it is not about competing. It is just that there are people who silently keep a tally of what belongs to you, day after day. Eleanor. Garrett's voice snapped me back to the present. I am asking you for the last time. What are you trying to pull? I placed both hands on the table, interlacing my fingers so they would not shake. I looked at him and then at Chloe. That is a question I should be asking the two of you. Chloe bit her lip, trying to maintain a serene expression. Eleanor, do not make things complicated. Let us just leave everything where it belongs. Yes, everything where it belongs. I nodded. Fine. Today we are going to make everything crystal clear. Right at that moment, the door to the coffee shop opened. A man in his early 40s, wearing an impeccable charcoal suit and carrying a black leather briefcase, walked in, accompanied by a young paralegal. He walked with a brisk pace, scanning the room until his eyes landed on our table. Garrett turned to look, and Chloe did the same. I watched their expressions shift at almost the exact same time. Harrison stopped by the table, gave me a slight nod, and then pulled out a chair to sit down. The paralegal placed a perfectly organized legal binder in front of him. "Apologies, I am 5 minutes late," he said. I shook my head softly. "You are right on time." Garrett looked from Harrison to me, his eyes beginning to show unease. For the first time in months, I felt my heart settle a bit, not because the pain had vanished, but because I knew that from this moment on, they no longer controlled the board. Slowly, I slid the divorce papers back toward me. I flipped to the very last page and looked up at the man who had been my husband. "You want a divorce? Fine," I said. "But before I sign anything, we are going to recalculate every single cent, every document, and every pending issue, including the things you think I do not know about." Garrett did not have time to reply. Chloe's face had turned paper white, and I, sitting perfectly straight, listened to the slow, steady beating of my own heart. It was as if, from the ashes of 3 years of resignation, a completely different woman was slowly standing up. As soon as Harrison sat down, the air around the table seemed to run out of oxygen. At the next table, the clinking of a spoon against a ceramic mug rang out. The espresso grinder at the counter continued its constant whir, and the yellow cabs kept rolling down Lexington Avenue. Yet, in the space separating the four of us, I could clearly hear Chloe's breathing begin to accelerate. The sweet, refined facade she had tried to uphold had cracked into a small wrinkle near her eyes. Garrett, for his part, straightened up in his chair, his shoulders tense. The hand resting on the edge of the table was no longer drumming, but his index finger twitched with an almost imperceptible rhythm, one that only someone who had lived with him for 3 years would have noticed. Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a file thinner than I expected. I glanced at the edges of the pages marked with colored tabs, all perfectly organized. He did not speak immediately. First, he addressed me with the same professional tone he used at the corporate office. "Miss Eleanor, before we begin, allow me to confirm something. I am here at your request, acting as your legal representation to protect your interests in the preparation of divorce proceedings and asset review. Is that correct?" I nodded. "Correct." Only then did Harrison turn to Garrett, polite, but direct. "I am Harrison, the attorney retained by Miss Eleanor. If you have both determined that the marriage is irretrievably broken, I suggest that from this point forward, all conversations strictly focus on documents, figures, and legal standing. That will save both parties time." Garrett let out a bitter, silent laugh. "Wow, you really set this up well, Eleanor. Are you more prepared than I thought?" I looked at him. If I had not prepared, I would have already signed those papers dividing everything down the middle right now, even the things that never belonged to you. Chloe shifted slightly in her seat and chimed in with her usual syrupy voice. "Eleanor, do not speak so harshly. Garrett just wanted everything resolved amicably right from the start." I turned to Chloe. "You sleep together in my house, you spend the money from my joint checking account, and now you have the nerve to talk to me about being amicable." Chloe's face flushed bright red, but she immediately slipped back into playing the victim. "I know you are angry. If you want to insult me, I will take it." "But the feelings." "Do not talk to me about feelings," I cut her off. My voice was not loud, but it was enough to shut her up. If this were truly about feelings, you would not have needed to take this route. Harrison opened the binder, pulled out the first document, and placed it in the center of the table. "Let us get straight to the point. According to the property deed for the condo located on the Upper West Side, the sole owner at the time of purchase is Miss Eleanor. The down payment was transferred from an account in the name of Miss Eleanor's parents to her personal account. Subsequently, the entire mortgage payment history demonstrates that the funds came from Miss Eleanor's separate personal account. When you are married, one person's money belongs to both," Garrett snapped. Harrison's expression did not change. Commingled funds during a marriage can sometimes be difficult to separate, but state law recognizes assets whose origin can be clearly traced as separate property. In the case of this real estate, the documentation is airtight. Garrett turned to me, his eyes burning with rage. "You hid this from me." I felt a bitter laugh form in my throat. "Hid it from you. You lived in that house for 3 years. Not once did you ask whose name was on the deed, or what money was paying for it. And now you say I hid it from you? Or is it just that you only care about how much of a payout you are going to get in the divorce?" My words made Garrett clench his fists. I knew he was holding back because the coffee shop was crowded, because a lawyer was present, and because he still wanted to keep up appearances. But his face had taken on an ashen hue, the exact same color it turned the day I showed him the photo of the car financing contract. Harrison pulled out another sheet of paper. "Next, The vehicle currently operated by Mr. Garrett. The financing agreement is in your name. The $15,000 down payment was wired from the couple's joint account. However, at that time, Miss Eleanor did not sign any document, nor provide written consent to convert marital assets into separate property in your name alone. Therefore, the funds for that down payment must be reimbursed to the marital estate. Chloe started shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Harrison, I think there must be a misunderstanding. Garrett uses the Tahoe for work. He did not buy it to. Harrison turned to her, maintaining his courtesy. Excuse me, I am conducting business with Mr. Garrett and Miss Eleanor. You are not a party of interest in these proceedings, so I kindly ask that you refrain from making statements on his behalf. The sentence was as smooth as it was sharp, leaving Chloe speechless. I looked at her and saw her hands gripping the edge of her skirt. The crimson polish on her nails looked flashier and trashier than ever. Garrett took a deep breath and said, struggling to keep his composure, Fine, let us assume the condo is off the table. The car gets reviewed, and the savings, by law, are still marital assets. Harrison nodded. Exactly. And that is why everything must be calculated accurately. Over the past 7 months, multiple withdrawals have been made from the joint account totaling nearly $50,000. The majority was transferred to your personal account, and from there, specific amounts were routed to a third party. Without anyone having to say her name, Chloe knew who that third party was. Her face went livid. Garrett, on the other hand, slammed his hand on the table so hard the water glass vibrated. I loaned money to a friend. What is wrong with that? Chloe was going through a tough time. I looked at him slowly. Whose friend? My friend, who needs my husband to secretly wire her thousands of dollars. My friend, who lives in my home, wears my clothes, uses my things, and sleeps with my husband. I paused and looked him dead in the eyes. Go on, I am listening. The coffee shop fell almost completely silent. I knew many eyes were glued to us, but at that moment, I no longer felt any embarrassment. I had already swallowed the worst humiliation that morning, standing outside my own bedroom door. After that, the stares of strangers were just wind. Suddenly, Chloe burst into tears. Eleanor, please, do not say these things in public. I know I was wrong, but it was never our intention to hurt you this much. I stared at her for a long time. There are faces, you know, that you recognize your entire youth. Faces you think you could spot even with your eyes closed. But only when they betray you do you realize that the most familiar thing can also be the most fake. From the moment you walked into my condo with that suitcase, everything was intentional, I said quietly, but every word rang clear. The only fool was me for taking so long to believe it. Chloe opened her mouth to say something, but the words did not come out. Garrett instinctively turned toward her. It was a fleeting look, but enough to catch a flash of impatience. They were no longer the united front they had been at the start. That is how people who think they hold all the cards usually act. As soon as their weak spot is pressed, they start glaring at each other with resentment. Harrison closed a section of the binder, his voice still measured. I will advise you in advance, Mr. Garrett, if both parties reach a settlement, everything will be much simpler. But if you insist on pushing this draft while intentionally omitting funds that must be reimbursed or misrepresenting assets, Miss Eleanor is fully within her rights to petition the court for a forensic accounting audit to investigate the money trail, the purpose of the transfers, and the dissipation of marital assets during the marriage. Garrett let out a mocking laugh. Are you threatening me? No, Harrison replied. I am simply informing you of the legal consequences should the conflict escalate. Garrett fell silent. I watched his Adam's apple bob slightly as he swallowed. He was afraid. Not afraid of losing me. He had discarded that fear a long time ago. What he feared was losing money, status, control over the narrative, and possibly other things he was trying to hide even deeper. I knew this because in the briefcase Harrison had brought that day, aside from the condo, the SUV, and the bank accounts, there was a section that had not yet been opened. A section related to Garrett's job, to the proprietary project data he was planning to take to a rival tech firm to secure a VP position. Harrison had not mentioned it because I did not want him to yet. There are cards you have to hold close to the chest until your opponent thinks they have seen it all. Garrett remained silent for almost half a minute before speaking in a noticeably softer tone. Eleanor, let us go back to the condo and talk in private. There is no need to make a scene here. Hearing him, I just felt exhausted. When he and Chloe drafted those divorce papers to force me to sign, he had not thought about talking in private. When he drained the joint account, He had not thought about negotiating. Only now, realizing that I was not going to sit there and take it, did he suddenly remember the words marriage and privacy. There is nothing left to talk about in private, I replied. Whatever needs to be said, let us say it here and make it crystal clear. Through the window, the sun had dipped, casting a honey-colored glare over the asphalt. I suddenly thought that a sunset is a lot like a marriage. Sometimes, from a distance, it looks warm, but only when you get close do you realize that the light is actually fading. Harrison pushed the divorce papers back toward Garrett. You may keep this draft, but in my professional opinion, it holds no negotiating value whatsoever, miss. Eleanor's counsel will send you a new proposal in the coming days, along with an asset inventory, the amounts to be reconciled, and the specific demands. When you receive it, I highly recommend you read it very carefully. Garrett did not pick up the papers. Chloe, beside him, no longer dared to touch his shoulder. The two of them, who had started off with an aggressive attitude trying to corner me, were now sitting in silence, as if the slightest movement could bring everything crashing down before their eyes. I was the first to stand up, resting my hand on the strap of my tote. My palms were still cold, but my legs were no longer shaking. Garrett, I said, looking down at the man who for 3 years had been my rock, the man I had trusted blindly. This is just the beginning. What you took from me through deceit, I will take back piece by piece. And what you owe me for your betrayal, you probably will not be able to pay back in a lifetime. With that, I turned around. Harrison stood up to follow me. Just as I reached the stairs, I heard the sound of a chair scraping sharply behind me, and Chloe's alarmed voice calling him quietly. Garrett, I did not turn back. There are affections that, once dead, are better left without a backward glance. Looking back only forces you to look at a corpse. Stepping out of the coffee shop, the late afternoon wind hit my face, crisp and sharp. I stopped for a few seconds under the shade of a maple tree on the sidewalk. Harrison did not rush me. He just stood beside me, waiting in silence. After a while, he asked in a very low voice, "Are you okay?" I watched the stream of cars passing by and felt a stab of pain in my chest. But this time, the pain did not crush me. It felt like a freshly cleaned wound. It stung to the core, but at least it had stopped festering. I am fine, I replied. And after letting out a long sigh, I added, but I do not think this is going to end with just a division of assets. Harrison. He turned to look at me, and I held his gaze. The issue regarding his job, I said, I will tell you everything tomorrow. The wind blew again. At the end of the cross street, a florist was busy tying up bouquets of sunflowers. I do not know why, but that image reminded me of my mother. Whenever there was a problem at home, she did not cry immediately. In silence, she would start washing dishes, wiping down the table, or folding a pile of laundry. It seems the women in my family are built that way. No matter how much it hurts, we do not allow ourselves to break down in the middle of the road. I tightened my grip on my bag strap and stepped off the curb. I knew that starting the next day, I would not just be dealing with a divorce. I was going to face the ugliest side of Garrett's personality, a side that, had I not discovered it with my own eyes, I probably would have gone to my grave thinking he was just a cheating husband, when the truth was far worse. That night, I did not go straight home. I let Harrison drive me to his office, a space on the 7th floor of an older building near Madison Square Park. The sky had darkened completely. The yellowish light from the street lamps filtered through the large windows, casting long streaks across the tiled floor. The city was no longer as loud as in the afternoon, but it was not quiet enough to take the weight off my heart either. Harrison made me a hot cup of tea, set it in front of me, and sat on the other side without rushing, without pressuring me with questions. He gave me time to breathe, to sort out the chaos inside my head. I held the mug with both hands, feeling the heat slowly spread through my palms. It was a small warmth, but enough to remind me that I was still standing. Harrison, I said after a moment of silence, the issue with Garrett's job, I want you to review it. He nodded. Whenever you are ready, I opened my bag and pulled out a small USB flash drive. I had been carrying it with me for the past 2 weeks, ever since the day Harrison handed me the first case file. I had not wanted to open it immediately because I knew that as soon as I saw what was inside, there would be no turning back. These are files I pulled from his laptop, I said. It was not like I was purposely snooping. I just wanted to check an old contract, and I saw it by accident. Harrison took the flash drive and plugged it into his laptop. The screen lit up, displaying a series of perfectly organized folders. He opened an Excel spreadsheet, then a PDF, and his eyes locked onto certain figures. The air in the office grew thick. I did not need to look to know that what he was reading was not something that could be swept under the rug. About 10 minutes later, he looked up. His expression was no longer as composed as it had been in the coffee shop. It was deeper, graver. "Are you sure these files belong to Garrett?" he asked. "Absolutely positive," I replied. "The user account is his, and the emails inside are his work emails." Harrison nodded slowly. "If what is shown here is accurate, the problem is no longer limited to a marital asset dispute." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He half closed the laptop, as if weighing his words. "There are indicators in these files that Garrett has been offboarding internal project data to a competing firm. It includes budgets, client lists, and highly classified proprietary code. If your company finds out about this, the consequences will be extremely severe." Hearing him, I felt my heart shrink. Not out of surprise. I had suspected it since the first time I saw those files, but hearing it confirmed by someone else hurt, just like the first time. "I have been at that company for almost 8 years," I said slowly. "I started as an entry-level associate and worked my way up to senior project manager. I treated every project as if it were my own, and he used exactly that to secure a new job somewhere else." Harrison looked at me, softening his voice. "What do you want to do?" I did not answer immediately. I stood up and walked over to the window. Down below, the headlights of the cars formed an endless river. There were people rushing home, others still out making a living, others, like me, standing at a crossroads, not knowing how many things they had just lost. "I have thought a lot during these 2 weeks," I said, my eyes still fixed on the street. "If it were just infidelity, I could have signed the papers, split the assets, and cut my losses. A one-time pain, and that is it. But this is no longer a private matter between 2 people." Harrison did not interrupt me. He let me finish. "I cannot stay quiet," I continued. "Not out of revenge, but because if I keep my mouth shut, the people who trusted me, my coworkers, will suffer the fallout." As I said it, I remembered the main boardroom at the firm, where I had sat countless times defending every strategy, every metric. I remembered the colleagues who had pulled all-nighters with me to meet deadlines. And I remembered the way Garrett used to put his hand on my shoulder and tell me he was proud of me. It turns out some words are not spoken to be kept. They are spoken to hide the truth. Harrison nodded, his eyes regaining their calm. "If that is your decision, I will help you prepare whatever you need. But you have to understand that when this comes to light, it will not stop at a simple warning. There could be a corporate forensic audit and potentially criminal charges for him." "I understand," I replied, "and I accept that." He watched me a moment longer and then said, "Then tomorrow you need to meet directly with the executive team at your company and clearly present what you have. On my end, I will simultaneously prepare the divorce filing under the terms most favorable to you, including the demand for the funds Garrett misappropriated." I walked back to the desk, picked up my mug, and took a sip. It had gone half cold, but the bitter taste was still there. "Thank you," I said. Harrison shook his head. "You do not have to thank me. I am just doing my job. The hardest part is up to you." I managed a faint smile. I have already survived the hardest part. He did not ask anything else. Maybe he understood that the hardest part is not facing the truth, but accepting it. Leaving his office, I took a yellow cab home. The car pulled up in front of my familiar pre-war building. I sat in the back seat for a few extra seconds before getting out. Night had completely fallen. The hallway was deserted, lit only by harsh, cold, fluorescent lights. I unlocked the door with my key. Inside, it was pitch black. There were no voices, no lights, no familiar smell of a home once shared by 2 people. I flipped the switch. The space was intact, but strangely alien. The sofa was still there, the dining table too. Garrett's jacket was still draped over a chair like always, but the feeling was gone. I walked into the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just like the day I stood outside listening, only this time, no one was inside. I opened the closet and pulled out a carry-on suitcase, not to pack my things and leave, but to pack away what no longer belonged to me. I folded Garrett's clothes piece by piece, placing them in the suitcase without rushing, without stopping, very much like my mother did whenever she tidied up the house. There are things that seem insignificant, but only when you have to pack them away with your own hands do you realize how heavy they truly are. When the suitcase was full, I zipped it up. The sound echoed dryly in the silent room. I left it in a corner, stared at it for a moment, and turned around. That night, I did not cry. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. In my mind, the image of Chloe and Garrett's words had vanished. Only a very clear sensation remained. It was truly over, but the end is not the resolution. The next day, I would walk into my company, not as a betrayed wife, but as someone who had to defend what she had built over 8 years. And I knew that when that door opened, my life would take a different path, one where no one could trample on my trust as easily as before. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten. A new day was arriving with the same normalcy as always, but for me, it was the start of a different journey. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was in a rush, but because I did not want to stay in that bed. There are places that were once a sanctuary, but after a blow, they become the most suffocating spots on earth. I went to the kitchen, boiled water, and made pour-over coffee like I did every day. The aroma drifted through the quiet apartment, but this time it did not feel familiar. I used to make 2 cups every morning, one for me and one for Garrett. He liked his coffee black, no sugar. Sometimes, rushing out the door, he would take just 1 sip and leave the rest. I used to dump it down the sink, thinking it was a meaningless little quirk. Now, standing alone, watching the steam rise from my mug, I saw more clearly than ever everything I had overlooked. I did not finish the coffee. I left it on the granite counter and went to get dressed. I chose a tailored charcoal pantsuit, simple and sharp. I put on light makeup and pulled my hair back. I looked in the mirror and saw my own face, but my eyes were different. There was no longer any doubt or waiting in them, only an almost icy clarity. Before leaving, I stopped by the corner of the bedroom where Garrett's suitcase had sat since the night before. I looked at it for a moment and then dragged it to the entryway. I did not put it out in the hallway, I just left it against the wall, right where he would see it the second he walked in. There are things that do not require words. Seeing them is enough. I locked the door and stepped into the elevator. In the enclosed space, my reflection looked stern in the stainless steel panels. I stood tall, gripping my tote, and took a deep breath. From that moment on, every step I took would not just be for me, but for everything I had nurtured for years. The town car dropped me off in front of the corporate headquarters at 8:15 a.m. The lobby was bustling as usual. Employees swiping their keycards, greeting each other, the beeping of the turnstiles. No one knew what I was carrying inside, and I did not want anyone to know. I took the elevator straight to the 12th floor, the executive suite. Before walking in, I stopped for a second, adjusted the collar of my blazer, and knocked on the door. "Come in." The chief operating officer's voice echoed from inside. I pushed the door open and walked in. There were 3 people in the room: the COO, the general counsel, and the VP of projects. They looked at me with some surprise, since I did not have an appointment, but they maintained their professional demeanor. "Eleanor, what can we do for you?" the COO asked. I closed the door behind me, walked up to the conference table, set my bag down, and said slowly, "I need to report a critical issue regarding the security of one of our proprietary projects." The mood in the room shifted instantly. The general counsel looked up, her eyes narrowing. "What exactly are we talking about?" I pulled the USB flash drive from my bag and set it on the mahogany table. "I suspect there has been an external leak of internal data. The employee involved is Garrett." The 3 of them fell silent for a few seconds, not because they did not understand, but because they needed time to process the gravity of the accusation. The COO furrowed his brow slightly. "You have proof?" "It is all here," I replied, including the data files, communication logs, and several unreleased strategy documents. The general counsel took the flash drive and plugged it into her laptop. The screen populated with files. She opened them, scanned them quickly, and stopped on a client roster. I clearly watched her expression shift from skepticism to tension, and finally, to absolute severity. "Eleanor, are you certain this data was pulled from our internal servers?" she asked. "I am certain," I stated. "I manage that project directly. I recognize every single file." The VP of projects rested his hands on the table, his voice dropping an octave. "If this is true, we are no longer talking about a simple policy violation. This is corporate espionage." I nodded. "I understand that." The COO did not speak right away. He stared at the screen for a long time before turning back to me. "Eleanor, be completely honest with me. Are you involved in this in any way?" The question did not surprise me. In corporate America, when a massive data breach occurs, the person closest to the source data is always the first suspect. No, it was just one sentence, but I felt a knot form in my throat. Sometimes, the trust of others is the only thing keeping you on your feet. The general counsel closed her laptop screen and turned to the COO. I recommend we immediately revoke all of Garrett's system access and initiate a full forensic IT audit. We need to do this right now. He nodded. Do it. And keep this strictly on a need-to-know basis. Then he looked back at me. And you, from now on, any documentation related to this project gets reported directly to me, no middlemen. Understood. The meeting was not long, but it was enough to set everything in motion. I stood up, thanked them, and walked out. When the door clicked shut behind me, I let out a long sigh. The hallway was still brightly lit. People were coming and going. But inside me, a piece of the burden had been lifted. I went back to my desk. Everything looked the same. My organized workspace, my monitor sitting over a stack of project binders to the side. My coworkers were still laughing and chatting about work over drip coffee. No one knew that in a single morning, a massive bomb had been unearthed. I sat down, woke up my computer, and saw a new email in my inbox. It was from Garrett. The subject line was brief. We need to talk. I stared at the text for a moment and opened it. Eleanor, I just got an alert that my system access has been revoked. What did you do? I read the message and did not reply. I closed the email and opened a new spreadsheet. There are questions that do not need answers. The person asking them eventually figures it out on their own. Around noon, my cell phone buzzed. Garrett's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring to the very end and then answered. What the hell did you do? His voice on the other end sounded panicked, completely stripped of the composure he had maintained the day before. My job, I replied. Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea what you are doing? Yes, I said, my voice steady. Do you have any idea what you did? There was silence on the line for a few seconds, and then his tone dropped. Eleanor, one thing is one thing and another thing is another. Work is work. Personal is personal. You do not mix them. I let out a soft laugh. You were the one who mixed them first. You used internal company data to buy yourself a better position. Garrett could not respond immediately. I could clearly hear his ragged breathing through the speaker. Are you trying to ruin me? He asked. I am not ruining anyone, I replied. I just stopped covering for you. The line went dead silent. I knew there were words that, once spoken, could never be taken back. I am coming to the condo tonight, Garrett said after a while. We have to talk. No need, I answered. Just come pick up your things. I already packed them, Garrett. I hung up. I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked out the window. The midday sun was not burning, but its light reflected off the glass facades of the skyscrapers with such intensity that I had to squint. Under that harsh light, I suddenly saw much more clearly the path I was taking. It was not easy, it was not light, but it was the only one I could choose if I wanted to save what was left of me. That afternoon, the company began to move quietly. A few people were pulled into private conference rooms. Systems were audited discreetly, and Garrett's name started popping up alongside questions that were no longer casual. I did not participate in any of those conversations. I stayed at my desk, doing my job like any other Tuesday. There are processes that, once initiated, do not require you to stand there and watch. They run their own inevitable course to the end. At the end of the day, I packed up my things and got ready to leave. Walking past the main boardroom, I noticed the door was slightly ajar and several executives were still inside. I did not stop. Stepping out of the building, the sun had already softened. The evening breeze blew lightly, carrying the familiar scent of city dust and hot asphalt. I walked down the steps feeling a little lighter than I had that morning. Not because everything was over, but because I knew I had taken the first step without looking back. And I understood that from now on, every subsequent step would not be to defend myself, but to face things head on. That night, I got home earlier than usual. Not because I wanted to rest, but because I knew Garrett was coming. Not to see me, but to get his belongings. But I wanted to be there anyway, not to talk, but to definitively close a chapter of my life. The apartment was as quiet as it had been that morning. I turned on the lights, dropped my bag on the table, and went straight to the kitchen. I made a simple dinner, grilled salmon, a side salad, and some roasted potatoes. Not because I still wanted to take care of someone, but because I needed a normal routine to keep from falling into the void. Just as the salmon started sizzling in the pan, I heard the front door unlock. The sound was familiar, but this time it brought no sense of anticipation. Garrett walked in, lingering in the entryway for a few seconds, as if scanning the apartment to see if anything had changed. His eyes stopped on the suitcase against the wall, and then shifted to me in the kitchen. There was no greeting, You really did it, he said, his voice heavy. I turned off the burner and turned around. As you can see, yes. He stepped further inside and closed the door behind him. He was not wearing a suit that day, just a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark slacks. But his polished look could not hide the obvious exhaustion etched into his face. The company is investigating me, he said. I know. You did not have to take it this far. I did not do anything, I replied. I just stopped hiding it. Garrett smiled bitterly. You changed really fast. I looked at him, and then I looked at the suitcase. I did not change. I just see everything clearly now. He fell quiet. The air between us was not as tense as in the coffee shop, but it was heavier, like a room that had been sealed shut for far too long. Eleanor, he said in a low voice. Can we talk for a minute? I did not say no, but I did not invite him to sit down either. I just stood facing him, keeping enough distance so we would not touch. I know I screwed up, he said. I am not going to justify what happened with Chloe. But could you help me just this once with the work issue? You just have to say it was a misunderstanding, a mix-up with the files, and the whole thing will be way less severe. Hearing that, I did not feel rage. I felt pity. Sadness that even in that moment, he still thought I would slip back into my old role. The woman who stayed quiet to keep the peace. Are you asking me to cover up corporate espionage for you? I asked coldly. I just need more time, he said quickly. I have that offer at the other firm. If this gets out, I lose everything. I am serious. So, you want to walk away with what you stole and leave me dealing with the fallout? Garrett frowned. You are being too harsh. I shook my head. I am just telling the truth. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a softer, almost begging tone. Eleanor, despite everything, we were husband and wife. I do not want things to reach a point of no return. I looked at him and saw not a single ounce of remorse in his eyes, just pure panic. Panic for his career, for his future, for everything he was about to lose. Not for me. You are wrong, I said slowly. Things reached a point of no return long before you even realized it. He froze, then let out a heavy sigh. Then what do you want? I did not answer right away. I walked over to the dining table. I picked up a stack of papers that Harrison had couriered over that afternoon and slid them in front of him. This is the new draft, I said. Read it. Garrett picked it up and flipped through a few pages. The more he read, the darker his face became. The condo was not to be split. The down payment for the Tahoe had to be returned, along with his half of the drained joint account. Every dollar he had wired to Chloe had to be accounted for and reimbursed. He stopped and looked up at me. And you are demanding additional compensation? I am not demanding it, I replied. I am just documenting exactly what you took. You are backing me into a corner. I am just stopping you from taking any more. Garrett gripped the papers tightly. Eleanor, if you do this, you leave me with no way out. I was left with no way out too, I said. The only difference is that I had no lawyer, I was unprepared, and I had no one on my side. My words silenced him. I saw a flash of pure bewilderment cross his face. It was brief, but enough to know that for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be completely cornered, out of options. And Chloe? He asked, dragging out his words. I have nothing to discuss with her, I answered. Everything related to the finances is your responsibility. You still hate her. I shook my head. No. She simply has nothing to do with me anymore. My answer threw him off. Maybe he expected harsher words, or at least a display of fury. But by then, that emotion had already burned itself out. When something breaks completely, you no longer have the energy to hate. All that is left is a void. Garrett dropped the papers back on the table and sat down, burying his face in his hands. I never thought things would end like this. I looked at him, feeling practically nothing. Neither did I. After a while, he looked up. If I sign, you stop right there? I will handle my end of the divorce, I said. The corporate investigation is out of my hands, he smiled bitterly. So, you are just going to let them deal with me? I am not letting anyone deal with anyone, I replied. You did something, and now you face the consequences. Silence fell again. Outside the window, it was fully night. The lights from the skyscrapers across the street clicked on one by one. Garrett stood up and walked over to the suitcase. He dragged it to the center of the living room, unzipped it, and looked inside. The clothes were impeccably folded, piece by piece. Nothing was missing. Nothing was extra. He stood there for a long time and then spoke quietly. You packed this thoroughly. Did you really not want me to come back for anything else? I nodded slightly. Yes. A soft yes, but it sounded millions of miles away. He zipped it back up and grabbed the handle. When he reached the front door, he stopped with his back to me. Eleanor, he said. I did not answer. I stood completely still. If you ever need help, let me know. I stared at his back, looking at a man I had once trusted with my life, now as foreign as an old acquaintance. I do not need it anymore, I said. The door opened and closed behind him. The click of the deadbolt was faint, but inside me, it sounded like a heavy, definitive period at the end of a long sentence. I stood motionless in the empty apartment for a long time. There were no footsteps, no voices, no trace of the man who had lived with me for 3 years. It was just me and a long, stretching silence. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the cold roasted potatoes, the untouched salmon. I sat down at the table, served myself a small portion, and ate slowly, bite by bite. It tasted the same as always, but the feeling was entirely different. There was no one left to wait for, no one to share it with, but there was also no one left I had to endure. Those small daily tasks helped keep my mind anchored. The night wore on. I turned off the living room lights, leaving only a dim lamp on in the bedroom. Before getting into bed, I swept my gaze across the room one last time. No suitcase, no jacket, no trace of him. I lay down, pulled the duvet up, and closed my eyes. I no longer saw Garrett's face. I only had a crystal clear feeling. I had walked a very long road, and I had finally managed to step off it. Tomorrow, everything would continue, but at least starting today, the past would not drag me down with it, and that was enough. The next morning, I got to the office earlier than usual, not because I had an overwhelming workload, but because I wanted to take charge of the new day. After everything that had happened, I understood one thing perfectly. If I stopped moving, others would make decisions for me. The building was the same as always, brightly lit, people filtering in and out. But stepping into the lobby, I noticed an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere, something subtle, but glaringly obvious to anyone involved. The glances from certain coworkers lingered on me a second too long before darting away. No one asked questions, but I knew the rumors had already started circulating. In a corporate environment, no secret stays buried for long. I headed straight to my floor. Sitting at my desk, I saw 3 new emails from the legal department and 1 from the COO. The content was brief. They needed me to provide more precise details on the projects Garrett had touched over the last 6 months. I opened each file and answered every question without rushing, without pausing, with absolute precision and thoroughness. There were metrics and dates I previously knew by heart simply to do my job. Now, they had become evidence. Every time I typed a line, I felt as if I were physically sealing off a part of my past with my own hands. Around 9:30 a.m., the general counsel called me into a small conference room. She was there with an internal controls auditor. They did not beat around the bush. Eleanor, the general counsel said with a serious but unhostile tone, we have done a preliminary review. The data you provided holds up. But to be absolutely certain before moving toward termination and potential litigation, we need you to confirm some specific timelines. I nodded. Ask whatever you need. The meeting lasted almost an hour. Every detail was scrutinized, every file cross-referenced with other data points. Sometimes they asked the same question in different ways, just to check my consistency. I understood it was standard operating procedure. When we finished, the general counsel looked at me for a moment. I know this is not easy for you, but you did the right thing. I said nothing. I just gave a slight nod. There are words that, even spoken softly, are enough to help you stand a little taller. Leaving the conference room, I went back to my desk. My team was still working, but the vibe had completely shifted. Some looked at me with caution, others with burning curiosity, and a few with quiet respect. I did not blame them. When a bomb drops, people tend to watch from a safe distance before deciding where to stand. At noon, I got a text message from an unsaved number. Eleanor, it is Chloe. Can we meet for a minute? I stared at the message for a long time. Seeing her name on the screen dragged up a chain of memories. From our childhood days to shared dinners, the times we swapped secrets about our families and careers, and the day she showed up at my door with her suitcase. I did not reply immediately. I set the phone down and kept working. But about 10 minutes later, a second text came through. I know you do not want to see me, but there are things I need to explain. I looked at the screen again, not because I wanted to hear her voice, but because I understood that there are things that, if left unsaid, simply stay suspended forever, unresolved. I texted back, 3 p.m., the usual coffee shop. She replied almost instantly. Okay. That afternoon, I left the office right on time. I did not overthink it on the way there. There are meetings you do not need to prep for. You just have to bring your clarity with you. The coffee shop was the same as the other day, the same table, the same window overlooking Lexington Avenue, the same afternoon light spilling over the wood. The only difference was that Garrett was not there. Chloe had already arrived. She sat with her back rigid, her hands folded in her lap, her expression tense. When she saw me walk in, she stood up instinctively. "Eleanor," she said quietly. I nodded and sat across from her. The silence stretched for several seconds. A barista walked over. I ordered a glass of iced water. Chloe ordered a drip coffee, but when they brought it, she did not touch it. "I am so sorry, Eleanor," she said, her voice weak. I did not react. I looked out the window, where the traffic kept flowing, and then looked back at her. "What did you want to tell me?" Chloe bit her lip, her eyes red-rimmed. "I know I screwed up. I have no excuse. But I do not want you to think I was like this from the beginning." "From what beginning?" I asked. "Since I moved in with you guys," she said quickly. "At first, I swear I only saw it as a temporary place to crash. I had absolutely no intentions with Garrett. I looked at her, letting her talk. But then we started talking more. He would complain to me about you, about how busy you were at the firm, about how little you cared about keeping up the apartment, and I saw how lonely he was. Hearing her, I felt a chill, not of heartbreak, but of disgust. Those excuses were so deeply familiar, so painfully cliché, that literally anyone could use them to justify horrible behavior. "He was lonely?" I asked. Chloe shook her head, and her tears finally spilled over. I knew it was wrong, but at that point, I just could not stop. "Could not or would not?" I pressed. She fell completely silent. I sighed softly. "Do you know what I truly cannot accept? It is not that you and Garrett slept together. It is the way you embedded yourself in my life, treating me like a sister while you did that behind my back." Chloe lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, and I have zero intention of forgiving you," I said firmly. She looked up, her eyes puffy and red. "Then why did you come today?" "To shut this down once and for all," I replied. "So that if we ever cross paths by accident in the city, I do not have to avoid you or carry any of this baggage." Chloe looked at me with an expression of shock that slowly melted into deep sorrow. "You are stronger than I thought." "I am not strong," I said. "I just do not want to be weak anymore." Another silence. The clinking of a spoon at the next table sounded crisp and clear. "Did Garrett say anything to you?" Chloe asked hesitantly. "Yes," I answered. "He wanted me to help him cover up the corporate theft he committed against my company." Chloe froze. "He actually asked you that? I have no reason to lie to you." She sat perfectly still, as if she had just realized something terrible. "I did not know that. I believe you," I said. "Because if you knew, you probably would not be sitting here asking me." Chloe offered a sad, pathetic smile. "Maybe I thought he was different. We both thought that at some point," I replied. That sentence left us both in silence, not because there were no words left, but because everything that needed to be said had already been said. I was the first to stand up. "I am leaving." Chloe stood up as well. "Eleanor, truly, I am so sorry." I looked at her one last time. Her face was still the same one I had known since childhood, but everything inside it had changed. "I heard you," I said, "but keep that apology for yourself." With that, I turned around and walked out of the coffee shop. The late afternoon wind was blowing, bringing in the crisp chill of the end of the day. I walked down the steps slowly, my heart much lighter than before. There are encounters that bring you no joy, but they help you drop dead weight. And for me, that was more than enough. I did not go straight back to the Upper West Side. I took a long walk along the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir in Central Park. The city skyline was beginning to light up, and the glow of the street lamps reflected in the water like scattered fragments of memories. A soft, humid breeze cooled my mind after such an exhausting day. The meeting with Chloe had not entirely healed me, but I no longer felt suffocated. There are things that, once you hear them with your own ears and see them with your own eyes, you no longer have to waste energy imagining. And when you stop imagining, the pain recedes. I stopped by the wrought iron fence, looking at the water. At that moment, I thought of my mother. I had not told her anything from the beginning, not to hide it from her, but because I needed to survive the initial impact on my own. But now that the dust was starting to settle, I knew I could not keep quiet anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. It rang twice before she answered. Eleanor. Her voice sounded as warm and steady as always. Hi, Mom. It is me. You have been very busy lately. I called you a few times and you did not pick up. I gripped the phone. Yeah, I have had a lot on my plate. My mother was quiet for a moment and then asked, softening her tone. Is something wrong, honey? That question put a lump back in my throat. I looked at the reservoir, forcing my voice to stay steady. Mom, Garrett and I are getting a divorce. There was silence on the other end. Not out of shock, but the silence of someone trying to process. What happened, sweetheart? She asked, without raising her voice. I did not tell her everything. I did not mention Chloe, or what I had heard and seen, or the corporate espionage. I just said it as concisely as possible. He is with someone else. My mother sighed, a very faint sound. I see. Just those 2 words, but I heard so much in them. No drama, no scolding, just a sad acceptance. Are you okay? She asked. I smiled a little, even though she could not see me. I am okay. Are you really okay? She pressed. I stayed quiet for a second before saying, I am starting to be. She did not push for painful details. She simply said, if you are too exhausted, come home to Connecticut for a few days. That sentence made my eyes well up with heat. I looked at the water and saw my own blurry reflection among the city lights. Okay, I will arrange my schedule and come see you, I replied. All right. And whatever it is, talk it out with me. Do not keep it all bottled up inside. I will. Bye, Mom. I hung up and stood there a little while longer before heading back toward the street. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because everything was completely resolved, but because I was no longer carrying it all by myself. The next morning, I arrived at the office like any other day, but as soon as I stepped into the lobby, the shift was undeniable. It was no longer just curious glances. This time, there were actual whispers. I walked past 2 receptionists and managed to catch a fragment. They say he got suspended for a data leak, and his wife works right upstairs. I did not stop. I got into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor. In the enclosed space, I watched the digital numbers climb, but my heart was not racing like it was the day before. The news was already out. When I reached my desk, a close coworker walked over. Eleanor, she whispered. I stopped organizing my desk. Yes? She looked over her shoulder and lowered her voice. Garrett got called up to the executive suite first thing this morning. Word is they suspended him pending an investigation. I nodded. Yes, I know. She looked at me with genuine concern. Are you okay? I am fine, I said. She did not push further. She just squeezed my arm in a show of support and went back to her cubicle. I sat down, turned on my monitor, and saw a new company-wide email. It was an internal memo, extremely brief. Please be advised that Garrett, an employee in the projects division, has been temporarily suspended from his duties pending an internal review. No details, no explanations. But for everyone on the floor, it was more than enough. I read the email and closed it. I felt neither satisfaction nor pity. It was simply another domino falling in the chain of events that had already been set in motion. Right at lunchtime, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother-in-law. I looked at the caller ID, hesitated for a few seconds, and answered. Hello, Eleanor. Her voice was not warm like usual. It sounded rushed and anxious. Garrett just told me about you two. What on earth is going on? I stood up and walked out to the hallway to speak privately. We are getting a divorce. Divorce? What divorce? She spoke quickly. Every marriage has problems, but things get fixed by talking. Why are you taking this to such an extreme? Take a breath. This cannot be fixed. If Garrett did something wrong, I will speak to him myself. I will set him straight. But you have to think about the family. I paused for a second and then said, I have already done a lot of thinking. She did not stop. I also heard you caused a massive issue with his job. You are destroying him. That sentence froze me. I am not destroying anyone, I said slowly. I just stopped covering up what he was doing. But he is your husband, she yelled, raising her voice. You are supposed to protect him. We will not be husband and wife for much longer, I replied. Silence fell on the other end. Then her voice softened a bit, though it remained incredibly tense. Eleanor, I know you are a capable woman and you make your own money, but a family is not just about who is right and who is wrong. Sometimes you just have to let things slide. Hearing her, I felt a deep emptiness. I loved my mother-in-law. She was not a difficult or overly critical woman. She used to defend me even more than she defended Garrett, but in that moment, I understood that her defense only existed as long as the waters were calm. When the ship starts sinking, people always side with their own blood. I understand, I said, but there are things I cannot let slide. She sighed. Then what do you want? We are going to handle things exactly by the letter of the law, I replied. I do not want to discuss the rest. There were no more arguments from her end. After a long pause, she simply said, "Have it your way." The call ended. I stood in the hallway for a moment and then walked back to my desk. Everything around me continued its normal course, but inside me, the last thread tying me to that family had snapped. There were no attachments left. That afternoon, I received a text from Harrison. Garrett's lawyer wants to meet tomorrow afternoon to finalize the settlement. Does that work for you? I read the message and replied quickly. Yes. I set the phone down and looked out the window. The late afternoon light bathed the skyscrapers across the street, just like it did every day prior. But the Eleanor sitting there was no longer the same person. I knew tomorrow's meeting would not be a walk in the park. When a person is cornered, they fight tooth and nail to save whatever scraps they have left. But this time, I was not the one backed into a corner. And I had absolutely no intention of backing down. The following afternoon, I arrived 15 minutes early. Not out of nerves, but because I wanted a few moments to myself before the meeting began. We did not meet at the coffee shop. We met in a small conference room at Harrison's law firm, a closed, quiet space with bright, sterile lighting that left no room for beating around the bush. Everything was straightforward, just like what was about to happen. I sat down, placed my bag on the table, and interlaced my fingers. There was a pitcher of water and 2 bound legal folders already prepped. I did not open them. I just sat there, taking deep breaths, centering myself. The door opened. Harrison walked in first, greeting me with a nod, followed closely by Garrett. Just the 2 of them, no Chloe. I looked at Garrett and immediately noticed the toll it had taken on him. His shirt was not perfectly pressed, his hair was messy, and his face looked visibly haggard. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The arrogant confidence had completely vanished, replaced by a tension he could not hide. He sat across from me without saying a word. Harrison took the seat at the head of the table and opened his folder with his usual brisk tone. Let us begin. No one objected. He pushed my draft toward Garrett. This is the settlement proposed by Miss Eleanor. Have you reviewed it? Garrett nodded. Yes, I have read it. And do you have any objections? Garrett did not answer Harrison immediately. He looked at the papers and then looked at me. I want to speak directly to you first, he said. I have no objections, I replied. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the last bits of strength he had left. I cannot accept all your terms. I know, I said. But those are my terms. If you take everything from me, I will have absolutely nothing left to start over with. I am not taking anything that belongs to you, I said slowly. I am just taking back what was always mine. He clenched his jaw. You know that is not what I mean. I know exactly what you mean. I held his gaze. You want to keep what you stole? My words hung in the air unanswered. Harrison did not intervene. He let us talk, limiting himself to jotting down a few notes on his legal pad. Eleanor, Garrett continued, lowering his voice. I am not denying I made a massive mistake, but you should give me an out. I already gave you an out, I replied. I have not asked for a single cent that is not backed by bank statements and proof. But you are including the wire transfers I made? He paused, as if carefully measuring his words. To Chloe. I am including the transfers that came out of our marital joint account, I corrected him. Who you gave the money to is your business. The tension in the room spiked, but it did not explode. It was like a rope stretched to its absolute limit, a millimeter away from snapping. Garrett leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling for a second, and then looked back at me. Do you really feel absolutely nothing for me anymore? He asked. The question did not surprise me. It was his last desperate attempt to drag me back into the past. Feelings have nothing to do with this, I said. This is simply a matter of equity. So if I accept all this, you will stop making my life hell? I have never made your life hell, I replied coldly. You did this all to yourself. He smiled bitterly. Now you sound like a lawyer. I had to learn, I said. A long silence stretched out. Then Harrison chimed in. Allow me to clarify one point. If an agreement is not reached today, this matter will proceed to litigation in civil court. In that scenario, the court will review not only the division of assets and finances, but also conduct that constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty during the marriage. I believe you fully understand what that implies. Garrett did not look at Harrison. He kept his eyes locked on me. Do you really want to take it to that extreme? He asked. If I have to. Yes, I answered without blinking. He nodded slowly, as if reality had finally crushed him. I need time, he said. You have already had time, I replied instantly. Since the day I handed you that draft, I need more, he insisted. At least a week. I did not answer right away. I looked at him, and then at Harrison. Prolonging this only makes sense if there is genuine intent to negotiate, Harrison stated. If this is simply a stall tactic, it is unnecessary. Garrett stayed quiet for a few seconds. I will sign, he said quietly. But I need to get my finances in order to make the payments in a lump sum. I looked at him, and for the first time, I could see he was not playing games. 3 days, I said. Not a day more. He looked up. 3 days is not enough. It is enough, I replied. You started moving your finances a long time ago. My words froze him in his chair. I knew he understood exactly what I meant. He had been prepping his exit strategy for months. He just never imagined his exit would look like this. Fine, he said after a long moment. 3 days. Harrison noted it down and nodded. Then we are in agreement. In 3 days, both parties will convene here to execute the final documents. The meeting seemed officially over, but Garrett did not stand up. He sat there staring at me with an expression that was hard to read. Eleanor, he said, his voice almost a whisper, if none of this had happened, do you think things would be different between us? I looked at him. That question was not trying to change the outcome. It was just him begging for an answer for his own conscience. No, I said. He furrowed his brow slightly. Why? Because what happened was not an unexpected mistake. I continued. It was the result of a rot that was already there. He did not say anything else. He stood up, grabbed his copy of the papers, gave Harrison a curt nod, and walked out. When his hand touched the doorknob, he paused for a fraction of a second, but he did not turn around. The door opened and closed. The conference room fell silent again. I sat there for a few seconds and then let out a long, shaky sigh. Not out of exhaustion, but because a moment of immense, suffocating tension had finally broken. Harrison closed his file. You handled that perfectly. I smiled weakly. I just did what I had to do. He looked at me with a different kind of respect. Not everyone would be capable of that. I did not reply. I stood up and grabbed my bag. 3 days, I said. Yes, he nodded. I will have the final copies ready for execution. I walked out of the office. The late afternoon air was mild. The sun had lost its bite. A light breeze blew down the avenue, carrying that familiar New York blend of exhaust fumes and blooming park trees. I paused for a moment on the steps, watching the pedestrians rush by. Life kept moving, completely indifferent to anyone's personal tragedies. Deep down, a very clear feeling began to form. It was not relief, and it was not joy. It was certainty. I was nearing the end of that brutal road, and this time, I would cross the finish line entirely on my own 2 feet. 3 days later, I did not arrive early, nor did I arrive late. I arrived exactly on time, maintaining the same precision, self-sufficiency, and lack of excess I had carried throughout my 3 years of marriage. Harrison's office looked identical to the last time. The small conference room, the long mahogany table, the hard white light. Nothing to distract from the reality of the moment. Everything was straightforward, just like what was about to happen. Harrison was already there. When he saw me walk in, he greeted me with a brief nod. On the table, 2 identical sets of documents were laid out, one for each of us, perfectly stapled and flagged with "Sign Here" sticky notes. Garrett arrived about 2 minutes later. He walked in without scanning the room, barely offering a greeting. His eyes brushed mine for a fraction of a second before locking onto the binder in front of him. The last 3 days clearly had not been kind to him. His face was paler, his eyes more sunken, but this time there was no fight left in his gaze, just a hollow acceptance. He sat down. No one spoke immediately. The room no longer felt like a pressure cooker. It felt solemn, like the dead calm that arrives after a catastrophic storm. Harrison broke the silence. Today we will proceed with the signing of the marital settlement agreement, as previously negotiated. I must remind both parties that once executed, all clauses are legally binding. Please review the documents one final time. Garrett nodded. I did the same. Harrison opened the folders and slid a copy toward each of us. I flipped through the pages, even though I had read them 100 times before. The lines of black ink, the crystal-clear clauses stripped of all emotion or memory. Just firm boundaries. The Upper West Side condo was legally mine. Garrett was legally obligated to wire back the portion of the Tahoe down payment taken from the joint account. The money transfers were meticulously documented and had to be reimbursed in specific installments. No shared children, no additional liabilities, no remaining ties. I stopped on the last page. The signature line waited blank. I set the pen on the table, not signing just yet. I looked up. Garrett was also staring at the last page, his hand holding a pen suspended over the paper without moving. A heavy silence stretched out. No one rushed him. Finally, it was Garrett who spoke first. Eleanor, he said, looking up at me. When we sign this, it is really over, right? The question no longer carried a pleading tone. It was more of a final confirmation, a verbal way of processing the reality crashing down on him. Yes, I replied. He gave a bare nod. I never thought this day would actually come, he said, his voice rough. Neither did I replied. He managed a minimal smile. 3 years went by really fast. I said nothing. For me, those 3 years had been neither fast nor slow. They had been a road with enough good parts to keep me walking, and enough cracks to end up breaking my ankles. I always thought that whatever happened, you would be the one who stayed until the bitter end, he continued. I thought so too, I said. My answer left him speechless. He looked at me a moment longer and then looked down at the paper. I am sorry, he said. This time it was not a rushed, desperate apology to save himself. It was slow, clear, and loaded with the weight of absolute defeat. I heard him, but I did not answer immediately. There are apologies that arrive too late, not because they lack meaning, but because they no longer possess the power to change a single thing. I heard you, I said. Just that. No lingering resentment, no grand absolutions, just an acknowledgement of receipt. He nodded as if he understood exactly what that meant, and lowered the pen to the paper. The exact instant the tip touched the line, I saw it. His hand hesitated with an almost invisible tremor, but it was there. Then, he signed. His name appeared on the paper in that familiar handwriting I had seen on so many leases, invoices, and even old birthday cards. This time, it was in a very different place. A place of closure. He put the pen down and Harrison turned to me. Miss Eleanor. I nodded and picked up my pen. My hand did not shake. I looked at the blank line and wrote my name. Eleanor. My handwriting was exactly the same as always. It had not changed. The only difference was that the woman holding the pen was no longer the same woman from 3 years ago. When I set the pen down, I did not feel the crushing pain I had always imagined. There was not a single second where my heart contracted with grief. There was only a burning, undeniably clear sensation. It is over. Harrison collected both copies, checked the signatures one last time, and stamped them with his notary seal. With this, everything is finalized, he declared. There was no applause, no congratulations, no formal ceremony, just a dry, simple sentence, but it was enough to officially bury a marriage. Garrett was the first to stand up. He did not look at me immediately. He adjusted his collar out of pure nervous habit, and then turned toward the door. I am leaving, he said. I nodded. There was no handshake, no final hug, no tearful goodbye. He turned his back to me and walked out the door. This time he did not stop in the threshold. The heavy door opened and clicked shut. I sat for a few more seconds, staring at the empty space across the table. There was no one across from me anymore. There was absolutely nothing left to say. Harrison gathered the executed documents and packed them into his briefcase. Do you need me to call a car for you to go home? No need, I said. I can go on my own. He nodded. If you need anything else moving forward, do not hesitate to contact me. I will. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out of the conference room. The hallway outside felt blindingly bright. The natural light pouring in through the large glass panes made everything look sharper, cleaner. I walked slowly, taking my time. When I reached the main lobby doors of the building, I stopped for a moment. Not because I was afraid to keep going, but because I wanted to lock that exact instant into my memory. A long, exhausting road had finally come to an end. No turning back, no regrets. Only the future remained. I walked down the concrete steps. The wind brushed softly against my face. New York City was exactly the same. The yellow cabs, the sirens, the people, everything kept flowing. The only thing different was me. I did not go straight back to the condo. I walked aimlessly for a while, letting my body get used to the feeling of empty space. I walked into a small, quiet coffee shop. I ordered an iced tea and sat alone by the window, watching the crowd blur past. Suddenly, a certainty hit me. I no longer felt abandoned. Before all of this, I used to think that if I lost someone, I would lose everything. But now I understood that there are certain things in life that only truly belong to you when you have the courage to let go of what no longer deserves you. I pulled out my phone and texted my mom. "It is done, Mom." She replied almost instantly, "Good. Come home for a few days, sweetheart." I stared at the glowing screen and smiled slightly. I am on my way. I locked the phone and took a sip of the iced tea. It was a little bitter at first, but it left a sweet aftertaste, somewhat like everything I had just survived. Chloe had not stolen my husband. She had simply taken a man who, in reality, no longer belonged to me anyway. And what I had managed to keep was not a bank account, a piece of real estate, or a corporate title. It was myself. A woman who had walked through a catastrophic betrayal without losing her essential worth. A woman who knew exactly when to pull the emergency cord, and who knew how to start completely over without needing anyone else to draw the map for her. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill my lungs, and stepped back out onto the sidewalk. Life was moving forward, and this time, I was walking with it, without looking back.